By the summer of 1968, everyone in New York knew the same thing. Bumpy Johnson was running out of time. His heart was failing, his body was slowing down, and Harlem understood what that meant. When a king weakens, vultures don't wait for the funeral, they circle early. And in the underworld, the most dangerous moment isn't when power disappears, it's when everyone believes it's about to. That was why the Mafia didn't wait for Bumpy Johnson to die. For decades, Bumpy had enforced a balance no one else could. Italians, Irish, politicians, hustlers, everyone knew where Harlem began and where it ended. He didn't control the neighborhood through terror, and he didn't sell it to the highest bidder. He ruled it through rules. And there was one rule that never bent. No matter how much money was on the table, no heroin in Harlem. Gambling could be regulated. Numbers could be contained. But heroin didn't build empires, it erased communities. In 1968, that rule stood in the way of millions of dollars. And the people who wanted those millions believed time was finally on their side. They didn't come with guns. They didn't come with threats. They came with a briefcase, a business proposal, and the quiet assumption that a dying man would eventually choose comfort over principle. What they misunderstood was that Bumpy Johnson had already made peace with death long before that morning. This story isn't about the moment his heart stopped. It's about the moment he refused to save himself, about why powerful men felt the need to negotiate with someone who could barely breathe, and about how a single decision made over coffee in a Harlem restaurant turned a death into a message so clear that thousands of people showed up days later to prove it had been heard. Because Bumpy Johnson's final words to the Mafia weren't shouted, written, or recorded. They were lived. And when Harlem buried him, it wasn't saying goodbye to a gangster. It was affirming a legacy that money, fear, and time itself had failed to break. By 1968, the underworld understood something most neighborhoods didn't want to admit out loud. Bumpy Johnson was no longer an immovable force because of his strength, but because of his timing. Power usually fades quietly, but Bumpy's decline did the opposite. It sharpened attention. As his health failed, every rule he had enforced for decades suddenly became negotiable in the minds of outsiders. Harlem, to the Italian mob, looked less like a fortress and more like an unopened vault whose lock was finally rusting. That perception mattered more than reality. When a leader weakens, ambition doesn't wait for confirmation. It accelerates, and the first move is never violence, it's legitimacy. This is why the approach in 1968 wasn't a hit. It wasn't even a threat. It was a conversation. For organizations like the Genovese crime family, expansion worked best when it looked inevitable rather than hostile. They didn't want Harlem through bloodshed. They wanted it through consent, or at least exhaustion. The calculation was cold but rational. A sick man thinks about legacy, about family security, about comfort. He thinks about the cost of saying no when there won't be enough time left to fix the consequences. That assumption had worked on dozens of aging bosses before. It had never been tested on Bumpy Johnson. What the Mafia misunderstood was that Bumpy's power was no longer operational, it was symbolic. He didn't need to enforce every rule personally anymore. The rules existed because people believed he would never betray them, even at the end. That belief was the real obstacle. As long as Bumpy was alive and unbought, Harlem remained politically radioactive. Any move made too early risked provoking a reaction that could spiral into chaos. Any move made too late meant the neighborhood would reorganize on its own terms. So the window was small, and it was closing. From the outside, the meeting looked like mercy, a respectful visit, a final offer. From Bumpy's perspective, it was something else entirely, a challenge to the meaning of everything he had enforced. They weren't just asking for permission to sell drugs. They were asking him to rewrite the moral boundary that defined his rule at the precise moment when refusing would cost him the most. That's what made the situation so dangerous. Not the money, not the men, not the threat of violence, but the timing. In the logic of organized crime, death usually weakens authority. But Bumpy Johnson was entering the rarest phase of power, the moment when a man has nothing left to protect except what he stands for. And that is the one position leverage cannot touch. For most of his career, Bumpy Johnson had proven he was willing to compromise on almost everything except one thing. Gambling could be regulated, numbers could be taxed, controlled, and kept out of children's hands. Deals with Italians, Irish, and politicians could be negotiated as long as they didn't hollow out the neighborhood. But heroin was different. It wasn't a racket to Bumpy. It was a weapon, and once that weapon entered a community, it didn't respect borders, rules, or promises. By the late 1960 seconds, the Italian mob, especially the Genovese crime family, saw heroin as the future. The old rackets were slowing down. Numbers didn't generate the margins they once did. Young people were angry, disillusioned, and numb from Vietnam, poverty, and police pressure. From a business perspective, heroin looked inevitable. From Bumpy's perspective, it looked like surrender. Not surrender to rivals, but surrender to destruction. This was the divide the Mafia never fully understood. To them, heroin was just another commodity, no different from liquor during Prohibition. To Bumpy, it was irreversible damage. Gambling took money. Heroin took lives, families, and entire generations. Once it spread, there was no stabilizing it, no containing it with rules or discipline. It turned neighborhoods into graveyards and left leaders presiding over ruins they could no longer control. That was why Bumpy's refusal wasn't emotional. It was strategic. He had watched what heroin did to other communities, how it erased informal economies, destroyed trust, and replaced structure with desperation. A neighborhood flooded with addicts couldn't defend itself. It couldn't organize. It couldn't resist outside control. Allowing heroin into Harlem would have guaranteed short-term profit and long-term submission, and Bumpy had spent his life preventing exactly that outcome. The Mafia believed time would soften this stance. They assumed illness would make Bumpy pragmatic, that fear of death would outweigh fear of legacy. What they failed to grasp was that heroin represented the one future Bumpy absolutely refused to leave behind. If he allowed it, everything he had built, every boundary he had enforced would be exposed as temporary. Harlem wouldn't remember him as a protector. It would remember him as the man who sold out at the end. That's why the offer on the table was never real. No amount of money could outweigh the cost. In that moment, the question wasn't whether Harlem would make more money without Bumpy Johnson. It was whether it would still recognize itself. And for Bumpy, a legacy that survived only in profit wasn't a legacy worth dying for. When the representatives of the Genovese crime family finally sat across from Bumpy Johnson, they believed they were entering a familiar scenario: an aging leader, a quiet table, a financial offer structured to sound respectful rather than threatening. This was how power usually changed hands without blood. You didn't conquer a dying man. You convinced him to step aside. The mistake wasn't the money. The mistake was assuming Bumpy still cared what happened to him personally. By that point in his life, Bumpy Johnson had already made peace with the inevitable. He wasn't negotiating for time, comfort, or security. He was negotiating for meaning. That distinction changed everything in the room. The men across from him were trained to read hesitation, greed, and fear. What they weren't prepared for was calm. Not the performative calm of a bluff, but the stillness of someone who no longer needed the conversation to go his way. This is where traditional leverage collapses. Money only works if the other side imagines a future improved by accepting it. Threats only work if survival is the priority. But Bumpy had reached a point where survival without integrity felt like failure. He understood that the Mafia's offer wasn't really about heroin or profit margins. It was about rewriting the story of Harlem after he was gone. If he accepted, they would say he eventually caved. That he was pragmatic at the end. That his rules were temporary, not fundamental. Bumpy couldn't allow that version of history to exist. The power of the moment came from its imbalance. Three men, backed by a national organization, sat across from a man whose heart could give out at any minute, and yet they were the ones uncertain. They needed his consent. They needed his silence. They needed him to legitimize what came next. Bumpy needed nothing from them. That asymmetry was devastating. It meant every sentence they spoke was an argument, and every sentence Bumpy spoke was a verdict. When he rejected the offer, it wasn't loud or dramatic. It was final. No counterproposal, no conditions, just a clear refusal that left no room for reinterpretation. In that instant, the Mafia lost its best chance to ease into Harlem. Any move made after that would be force, and force carried consequences they weren't prepared to absorb in a neighborhood that still saw Bumpy Johnson as its moral center. This is why the meeting mattered more than the outcome. Even before his heart failed, Bumpy had already closed the door. He showed the Mafia something they rarely encountered, a leader who could not be pressured because he no longer needed to win. By choosing legacy over longevity, Bumpy Johnson turned a routine negotiation into a permanent boundary. And once that line was drawn, it didn't matter how much time he had left. The decision had already outlived him. What happened next was inevitable, even if no one in that restaurant could have predicted the exact moment. Bumpy Johnson didn't collapse in the middle of a speech or during a confrontation. He broke down after the decision had already been made. That timing mattered more than the medical cause. In the underworld, truth is often shaped less by facts than by sequence. And the sequence was brutal and unforgettable. The Mafia made its offer, Bumpy said no, and then his heart gave out. From the outside, it looked like coincidence. From inside Harlem, it looked like confirmation. For decades, Bumpy had warned that some lines could not be crossed without consequences. Now, as he struggled for breath, those consequences crystallized instantly. Three Italian mob representatives sitting across from him suddenly understood the danger they were in. It didn't matter that no one had touched him. It didn't matter that doctors would later say his heart had been failing for months. What mattered was perception. A man revered by his neighborhood was dying in front of witnesses, moments after rejecting a heroin deal. In a place like Harlem, perception is power, and power moves faster than ambulances. This was the moment when Bumpy's final act of leadership emerged. Even as his body failed, his instincts did not. He stopped retaliation before it began. He ordered his people to stand down and let the Mafia representatives leave. That wasn't mercy, it was strategy. By letting them walk out alive, Bumpy ensured they would carry the story back with them unchanged, unsoftened, and terrifying. They wouldn't describe a negotiation, they would describe a warning. The message was clear without being spoken aloud. This is what happens when you try to buy what isn't for sale. If Bumpy had died surrounded by violence, the moment could have been dismissed as chaos. Instead, his death became symbolic, clean, unarguable. The refusal stood uncontested, sealed by the timing itself. Harlem didn't need revenge to make the point. The point had already been made. For the Genovese crime family, this was the worst possible outcome. They hadn't just failed to secure Harlem, they had become associated with the moment its protector fell. Any aggressive move afterward would look like desecration. Any delay would look like fear. Either way, their options narrowed instantly. Bumpy Johnson didn't die issuing threats. He died having already delivered the message. In the language of power, that distinction is everything. His heart stopped, but his authority didn't. In fact, it expanded because now it belonged not just to him, but to the memory of what he refused to do. And once a death becomes a message, no amount of money can erase it. 5 days later, Harlem delivered its answer. More than 5,000 people lined the streets to attend the funeral of Bumpy Johnson. Not soldiers, not enforcers, ordinary residents, shop owners, church members, musicians, parents, teenagers, people whose lives had been shaped, quietly and unevenly, by the rules he enforced. In the underworld, funerals are usually measured by who shows up in suits and black cars. This one was measured by how far the line stretched and how long it took to move. That turnout wasn't grief alone. It was recognition. For the Mafia, this was the final calculation they hadn't anticipated. Power is supposed to transfer when a leader dies. Territory opens, deals reset, but the crowd made something clear. Bumpy Johnson's authority had already been absorbed by the community. You could remove the man, but you couldn't remove the standard he left behind. Any attempt to move in immediately would look like an invasion of a mourning family, not a business expansion. That's why the response after his death was cautious, indirect, and delayed. No triumphant takeover, no public declaration, just probing, testing, and retreating. The memory of that final refusal and the image of thousands of people honoring it hung over every decision. Harlem had become expensive in a way money couldn't solve. This doesn't mean the neighborhood was spared forever. History isn't that kind. Without Bumpy, the old rules weakened. New players arrived who didn't share his boundaries. Drugs eventually spread, damage followed, and Harlem suffered. But even then, the Mafia never achieved total control. Not the way they did elsewhere. Something resisted. Something slowed the process. That resistance came from memory. In Harlem, Bumpy Johnson wasn't remembered as a saint or a myth. He was remembered as the man who said no when saying yes would have been easier and safer. That memory mattered. It shaped how people talked, how they judged newcomers, how they understood what had been lost. In criminal politics, memory is infrastructure. It doesn't stop everything, but it changes the cost of every move. The funeral was the verdict. Not guilty of selling out, guilty of standing firm. And once a verdict like that is delivered by an entire neighborhood, there is no appeal process. The Mafia could wait, they could adapt, but they could never pretend that Harlem had been conquered, because conquest requires consent at the end. And on that day, 5,000 people made it clear that consent was never given. In the end, Bumpy Johnson didn't defeat the Mafia with force, money, or alliances. He defeated them with a refusal that couldn't be revised. When his heart failed, the decision had already been made, and everyone in the room understood it. Harlem was not for sale. Not now. Not later. Not even after he was gone. That's why his final words weren't a speech, a threat, or a promise. They were an act. He was offered comfort, security, and a quiet ending. He chose something harder, leaving behind a standard instead of a deal. In a world where power is usually measured by what you can take, Bumpy Johnson showed that real authority is measured by what you refuse to give up, even when time is running out. The crowd at his funeral wasn't there to honor a criminal empire. They were there to acknowledge a boundary, a line that had been held long enough for people to recognize its value. Harlem didn't gather because Bumpy was perfect. They gathered because, at the final moment, he proved that some principles don't weaken with age, illness, or pressure. History moved on. New players arrived. New poisons followed. Harlem suffered in ways Bumpy had tried to prevent. But something remained, a memory that made exploitation harder, slower, more contested than it would have been otherwise. That memory was his real legacy. Because in the end, Bumpy Johnson didn't leave Harlem richer. He left it unbought. And in the language of power, that is the rarest final statement a man can make.